think we're ready to go. And welcome to Conway Hall, and thank you for coming along this evening. My name is Giles Game, and I'll be chairing tonight's debate. I've been able to organise this through various personal connections with our four speakers tonight, and through the generous sponsorship of a friend, and to all these people I am very grateful indeed. I'll introduce the panel and talk through the running order for the night in a minute, but first of all, we'd just like to take an opening vote, nothing too scientific, just by way of a show of hands. The motion is, this House believes that Islam and the West have irreconcilable differences. I'm going to ask you all if you're for, against, or undecided. So, first of all those who are for, please raise your hands. Okay. That's a pretty comfortable majority. The opposition have their work cut out. Yes, the question is, this House believes that Islam and the West have irreconcilable differences. Okay, there we go, so that's four. And all those against, first off? Okay. And anyone who is undecided as yet? Excellent. So there we go. Floating voters susceptible to being influenced. We'll shortly go on to opening speeches, and these will be timed to a maximum of 7 minutes, just so we can proceed as quickly as possible with a good start to the floor debate. And for those of you who've been to these kinds of events before, I'd just like to say there'll be no interventions, points of information, any of this kind of thing. That'll just eat into the speaker's time. And if you do want to show your appreciation for anyone, then please do so profusely through the traditional medium of applause after they've finished. I'll be calling 1 minute and time, just to keep things to book. So, the people who come to speak this evening, first of all, to propose the motion is Anne-Marie Waters. Anne-Marie is leader of the new For Britain political party. She founded this party following her second-placed defeat in the UK Independence Party leadership election. She is a long-time opponent and critic of Sharia law, and founded the Sharia Watch UK group, which monitors Sharia in the UK and around the world. Next will be our lead opposition speaker, Sheikh Dr Mohammed al-Hussaini. Mohammed is an academic theologian who is currently Senior Fellow in Islamic Studies at the Westminster Institute. He has also lectured in defence and counter-terrorism contexts at the George Marshall European Centre for Security Studies and the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. He is a keen boxer and a national gold medalist Irish singer. Seconding Anne-Marie on the proposition side is Alan Craig. Alan lives with his family in Muslim-majority Forest Gate in the East End of London. He is a practicing Christian and considers himself an activist, having led the successful decade-long campaign against the proposed 45,000 capacity London Olympic mega mosque. Alan insists that in our democracy, he is both free to respect and like his Muslim neighbours, which he does, and to say what he likes about Islam. And finally, supporting Dr al-Hussaini, Dr Michael Arnheim. He is an English barrister, a sometime fellow of St John's College, Cambridge, and the author of 19 published books to date. His interests include both religion and human rights. His published books include The God Book, God Without Religion, and 3 books on human rights, most recently, A Practical Guide to Your Human Rights and Civil Liberties. So to all of our speakers, thank you very much, and I'd like to ask I would like to ask Anne-Marie now to propose the motion.
Good evening. Thank you for organising this debate, and it's very nice to be back in Conway Hall. It has been a long time since I've been in Conway Hall. There never is much time, so I will get straight to the point. And this debate about whether Islam is compatible or reconcilable with Western society really comes down to one thing, to one primary question. What is Islam, and what do we mean by Islam? Because if we're going to decide this, we must know what we are talking about. So what is it? You may hear from the other side of this debate this evening, or from the other side of this debate generally, that Islam is whatever Muslims make it, that it is essentially subjective. But by very definition, this can't be true. People look to religion for guidance, for advice on how to live. Therefore, there must, by definition, be an objective source for people to turn to for that guidance. In the case of religions, the objective source is usually a core written scripture or the philosophy of its founder, or both. In short, Islam and Muslims are not the same thing. The follower and the guidance they follow cannot, by definition, be the same thing. And Muslims are human beings with all the complexities of human beings. They are the readers of the book, not the book itself. And many will interpret that book differently, but the book remains the same. It is objective. So if Islam is not Muslims, then what is it? And you may also hear from the other side of this debate that the Islam that I describe is not the true Islam, and that the true Islam is compatible with Western society. So what is true Islam? Islam is the Quran and Muhammad, or it's nothing. If Islam is not the Quran and Muhammad, then this pen is yellow. In other words, nothing has an objective reality. Everything is what we want it to be, but in reality it isn't. And this pen is black, not yellow, and the Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. And to understand then whether Islam is compatible with the West, you have to look to the Quran and Muhammad. And it's here that the interpretation dilemma begins. To get an idea of how Islam is interpreted by Islamic scholars, imams, and leaders of Islamic states the world over, we can use this to decide whether it is compatible with the West. And I'll briefly address what is meant by the West, and we all know what we mean by the West, especially in the context this evening. We mean freedoms, we mean religious and philosophical freedom, equal rights for all people before the law, science and reason, freedom of speech and expression. For our purposes tonight, that, I would argue, is what we mean by the West. And however imperfect the West may be, those freedoms there's still a light shining. Those still represent the West we are discussing. So let's see some examples of how Islam is interpreted by its scholars and its leaders. There are 13 countries in the world that execute people for blasphemy and apostasy. And these are Muslim majority, and the death penalty is justified and sustained by reference to Islamic scripture by religious leaders. This is not the extreme fringe, it's the law of the land, and such laws have widespread public support in many nations, and largely, I would argue, because it is justified in Islamic scriptures. Now, the difference between religious freedom and death for blasphemy cannot be any more stark. They are each other's opposite. They are therefore entirely irreconcilable. There's no middle ground, it's one or the other. Equal treatment for all people before the law. And nowhere is this difference between Islam and the West seen more profoundly than in the status and treatment of women. And in the West, however imperfect we may be in practice, violence against women is a criminal offense, and a woman has the same social and political rights as a man. Now, in Islam, in both scripture and practice, this is far from the case. The Quran designates women to be inferior to men, And across the Muslim world, the mainstream, not the fringe, women are subject to forced marriage, child marriage, honor violence, and injustices, great injustices, such as their testimony being worth less than a man's, by the state. This is the treatment they receive by the state. It is a treatment of women that most Western women simply would find unfathomable. It is not, therefore, reconcilable with the concept of equal rights of all people before the law as we know it in Western democracies. And a further argument you may hear is, but not all Muslims behave like this, so therefore it can't be Islamic. It is Islamic. It is Islamic because it comes from the Islamic scriptures. And what moderate Muslim societies demonstrate is not a moderate form of Islam, but a distance from Islam. In other words, the more influence Islam has in a society, the fewer freedoms and rights can be found. So in summary, the question you're being asked this evening is, what is Islam? Is it the, with respect, wishful thinking of reform or moderate Muslims? Or is it the literal text of the Quran? Others are asking you to accept that Islam is what they say it is. I'm arguing that you should accept Islam as the Quran says it is. Not what I say it is, but as the Quran and the Hadiths of Muhammad say it is. And what they say it is not, by any objective standard, reconcilable with Western freedoms as we understand them today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. And now, Mohammed, please, to speak first for the opposition.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on the panel today. Unlike other debate formats, there's actually a significant amount of agreement on many of the issues of concern. None of us are here to say that Islam is a religion of peace, when the realities are concretely other than that. But at the same time, I feel that this discussion is very much about the question of whether there is an exceptionalism to Islam that sets it apart from the other beliefs and practices in the West, Islam being unique, singular, either superior, according to the Islamists, or particularly unique in its violence and evil, according to the Islam critics, utterly different, as it were. And I would contend, as a scholar, that there is actually nothing special about Islam at all, and in fact, quite the opposite. And rather, of all the great world religions, Islam is probably the least unique, the least inventive, the least exceptional. But rather, as part of the Western branch of Semitic religions, Islam has taken and borrowed and absorbed teachings and practices from all kinds of other sources. So, for example, in all the three faiths, we have teachings that result in the worship of the one God, the honoring of the ethical values, and the support for pious and honest living. And at the same time, genocide, misogyny, slavery, all three traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in their primary texts, support slavery, support the second-class status of women, and this ambivalence is part of the nature of all the great world civilizations. Islamic law is fundamentally based on Jewish halakha. Stoning for adultery isn't found in the Quran. It was taken from Judaic sources and combined with Arab tribal custom and became the model, the basis for Islamic teaching in this area. Throughout my academic career, teaching in different religious contexts, the greatest honor of my life was being the first non-Jewish member of staff on the books at Leobeck College, a Reform Jewish college, and teaching Islamic classical studies to rabbis and rabbinical students. And every once in a while, I think, come on, this has got to be us. But no, it isn't. It's found, there's a cognate in Jewish midrashic sources, or there is an exact parallel in classical rabbinic sources. The Jewish Bible upholds the holiness code in the book of Leviticus. It says, Kedoshim tihu ki kadosh ani Adonai. Be you holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. It enjoins high ethical values, treatment of the stranger with justice. And at the same time, in Deuteronomy chapter 20 and elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, we talk about the massacres of the Canaanites and the genocide committed against those inhabitants. The penalties for a rapist who rapes a virgin woman is for the victim to be made to marry her assault, the person committing the assault. There are things in my tradition that shock me, that scare me. There are things in your tradition that should shock you and scare you. And the reason is that our traditions are intimately interlinked. We have borrowed, we have stolen, we are part of mongrel traditions. And of all traditions, my tradition has actually created the least. Rabbinic Judaism, my rabbi colleagues say repeatedly that if it hadn't been for the actions of a couple of Roman legions that destroyed that nationalistic, jihadist Judaism of 2,000 years ago, that nationalistic, imperialistic Judaism, Judaism in the 21st century could end up looking very much like Islam. And instead it was destroyed, and instead a rabbinic Judaism, a thoughtful, deep-thinking, critical rabbinic Judaism was allowed to develop in exile. Andalusia was the convivencia where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived alongside each other and developed a warm way of interacting at the same time as the horrors of medieval Europe were being perpetrated against Jewish minorities. And at the same time, if you go to these different countries, like you go to Sana'a and the Jewish quarter there, you have to go down some steps to go into the front door because Jewish houses had to be of an inferior status, built lower than Muslim houses. Christians and Jews were treated as second-class citizens. Every religious tradition has its ambivalences, and I would fully support Anne-Marie's view that Daesh, that ISIS's interpretation of Islam is an entirely legitimate reading of a text where in Surah 9:5 it talks about uqtul al-mushrikeen haythu wajadtumuhum, kill the unbelievers wheresoever you find them. And those same texts were used by the Crusaders, Deus Vult, to annihilate non-Christians during the Crusades. They were used by Baruch Goldstein to commit his atrocity in Hebron. But at the same time, those traditions, it does not invalidate the fact that our rabbinic friends and our Christian friends have learnt that these texts are texts of their time and are to be read and to reread in different contexts. In relation to the fact that we do not any longer live in a tribal vendetta desert society. As for Western values, well, there is nothing particularly intrinsic about human rights in Western society. Aquinas and Augustine talked about the killing of heretics, not just their damnation in the hereafter, but their killing in this world. Even in our present time, the rights to divorce that have always been there in Islamic civilization were only granted to women in the 1960s. The right to inheritance that's always been there in Islamic civilization was only granted in the 19th century, and yet, as Anne-Marie rightly says, look at the way that women are treated in the Muslim world today.
7 minutes.
Thank you. And so I would like to continue the conversation with you during the question and answer, but I would say that human rights in the West, look at Grenfell Tower, look at the treatment of the poor, human rights for the poor and for those in poorer countries. Future generations will judge Western civilization along those terms. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. And now, Alan, please, if you would second the proposition for us.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here and to debate this extremely important topic, this extremely important subject. Normally when you hear this sort of debate about this, it's a question of how violent is the West versus how violent is Islam, how much human rights there are in the West, how much human rights there are in Islam, and so on. And there's sort of competing claims, and the argument goes backwards and forwards. It's sort of bidding war to sort of see who will do better. I want to, if I can please, cut through that today. I don't want to get involved in this sort of bidding war. I want to cut straight through that. And I want to put forward to you this evening an argument that, frankly, I would not have been able to put forward perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, and certainly not in a place like this. Since the Second World War, indeed earlier than that, but since the Second World War particularly, over the half century or more since then, there has been a decline, and a fairly rapid decline, in the religiosity of the Western world. Churches have closed, congregants have reduced, secularism has risen, atheism as an alternative ideology has risen hugely. And so consequently, by the turn of the millennium, we could consider ourselves to be a post-Christian society, or many people would consider us to be a post-Christian society, and that everybody thought that religion would disappear because we were all modern and very progressive and very trendy. Then 9/11, bang, 9/11, and suddenly religion was back, and back in a big way. Suddenly people were asking, what on earth is all this about? What is this Islam? What is happening here? And as Islam, we saw the rise and rise of a fairly assertive form of Islam, right across the Western world, and of course elsewhere around the globe. We see the rise of this assertive form of Islam. So it's been really interesting for me as a committed Christian to see how the debate has changed. There isn't time in just a short period of 7 minutes allocated to each one of us here to go through this, and hopefully we'll go through this in greater detail. But it's been really interesting to see how actually people in the West have been refinding Christianity. By that I mean a sort of cultural Christianity. I don't believe from the numbers of people going to church has risen, although it has in many ways in the UK more by immigration than anything else. But it's really interesting to me that people like Richard Dawkins, who during the 1990s made hay while the sun shone and was really a sort of a really aggressive atheist, now refers to himself quite openly as a Christian atheist, as a cultural Christian. He likes the Christianity around him. Even my colleague here was telling me the other day, and I think she would argue that she's quite a strong secularist, but she was telling me the other day, and I hope she won't mind, she was saying it privately, but I think it's her public position. She's not looking for the disestablishment of the Church of England. Somebody who I really admire a great deal, and I count him as a personal friend in some ways, but Douglas Murray, who himself is an atheist, if you go on, you can see one of his recent statements. He said, if you're British, you are Christian. You may never go near a church, you may never want to believe in God, but you are in some sense you're a Christian. He said, if you're that, we dream, he said, we, to the interviewer, we dream Christian dreams. In other words, he's so imbibed, brought up within this Christian culture, which we are refinding, that he would say that actually we are all Christians. So now we've got ourselves this situation when that is it. And what I want to do is, what we're really comparing is, for that sake, if we understand it, accept that thesis, we're comparing Christianity and Islam. If Christianity was the cradle of our civilization, from which many of our freedoms and so on have come from, if you accept that thesis, we're comparing the both. And the way to cut through this debate about whether they are acceptable, whether they're compatible or not, the way to cut that is to go back to the founding documents, to go back to the foundations. In other words, I'm going to argue that if you go back to Muhammad and the Quran, and you go back to Jesus and the New Testament, you'll see quite clearly that the two are completely incompatible. At a theological level, Islam denies the central tenet of Christianity. On your war memorial, in your cemeteries, on the top of your church, and many people wearing around their neck, they wear a cross. That is the central thing. The central Christian belief is that Jesus died for us. He sacrificed himself for us. Islam denies that. It says that they believe in Jesus, but that he didn't die on the cross. Actually, he just sort of fainted and they took him away, or some sort of theory like that. But let's move away from a moment from the theology of it. Let's look at the way that both Muhammad on the one hand and Jesus on the other, why both of them want to inaugurate a new form of society, a new form of organization, of society. Muhammad himself moved from Mecca to Medina, and that was the start of the Islam era, that migration. And he moved to Medina, and he became not only a religious leader, but he became a political leader. He became governor. He became a military leader, a very successful one. Some people compare him like Napoleon because he was so successful in his wars. And indeed, if you go to the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul today, proudly displayed in there are two swords which were apparently owned by Muhammad. You can find Muhammad. And he himself participated in battles. At one stage, he was nearly killed. So he became what we would understand to be a national leader of his particular community in all areas of it. And that's the sort of society he wanted. And once he died, and the following four, what they call the rightly guided caliphs that followed him, they too were political and military leaders, as well as religious leaders as well. They created a theocracy. And from that, we have to understand that the real Islam is always a theocracy. It cannot be. The separation of church and state is not understood. Jesus, on the other hand, wasn't interested in political power. Not at all. He said, the kingdom of God is in you. His was a spiritual kingdom. It's a relationship between people and their God. He said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So he created an invisible kingdom. Territory was not his business. And so all the way through over the 2,000 years since Christianity and 1,400 years since Islam, but of course the societies have gone backwards and forwards. Of course they have, and it hasn't always been good. I can't defend the Crusades at all. When Christians took arms in the name of Christ, I don't believe that's at all Christian. But just as if you're a communist, you want to go, at some stage you want to go back to the foundation document, so you go back to Marx and to Das Kapital. If you're an American, you want to go back to the foundation, you go down to the American Constitution to find out what's your identity and so on. So for us, you go back and you compare the Christianity from which we originally came in the West and the Islam that is coming more and more, and you find the two are completely incompatible. I hope we'll have more chance to discuss this once we get over this particular section and move into the debate between ourselves. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Michael, please, if you would deliver the last of the formal speeches, seconding the opposition.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've got to start by congratulating the opposition on achieving something that I've been trying to do for the past number of days, because I really, really like fruit, and cherries in particular, and yet you just cannot find cherries in London now, for the past few weeks. Impossible. But the opposition have done so. They've done an excellent job of cherry picking. Wonderful. I have to congratulate them. Because the thing is, Islam is not monolithic, and Islam accounts for 1.8 billion people on this earth. 24% of the world population. So to lump them all together under some extremist label is really cherry picking. There was a Gallup poll done a few years ago which revealed that only 7% of Muslims were radical, 93% moderate. I won't go into all that. And also, there have been polls to show that there's an overwhelmingly negative view amongst Muslims of ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you prefer to call it. Overwhelmingly negative. But I really want to concentrate on the flip side of this argument. In other words, the West is a lot of vague talk about equal rights, equal rights. Yes, the West is supposed to stand for equal rights. Does it? No, no longer. The West has been hijacked by political correctness. Who ever voted for that? Nobody. But that is the dominant philosophy in the West today. It's a sick, sick, sick philosophy. Sick. And does not stand for equal rights. Let me just give you, I have very little time, so I'll give you one example which I think is particularly shocking and which is very typical, unfortunately. Comes from Northern Ireland, where there was this customer who placed an order with a Christian bakery for a cake with the icing reading, "Support gay marriage." Well, the Christian owners of the bakery said, "Sorry, we don't support gay marriage. We believe it's sinful. We're not going to do a cake like that." As it happens, same-sex marriage is not even legal in Northern Ireland. It's not legal. But, well, the prospective customer went elsewhere. He got his cake done with that slogan. But he took the Christian bakery to court and won, both in the county court in Belfast and in the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal. He won. Why? Because the bakers were found to be guilty of discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation and guilty of discrimination on grounds of political opinion or religious belief. Now just analyze that for a second. What we're talking about here are the rights of the customer to have this support gay marriage on the cake, and the rights of the bakers to say, "No, we're not prepared to do that." In fact, the rights of the bakers were trampled underfoot in three very major ways. Talk about equal rights. Their freedom of speech was suppressed. They weren't even allowed to be quiet about their views, certainly not allowed to oppose gay marriage. They had to promote gay marriage. They were forced to promote gay marriage, number one. Number two, their freedom of religion and belief was suppressed. They could not express their belief that we don't agree with gay marriage. And thirdly, their freedom as a business, which you would expect any business to have, to accept or reject an order, that was taken away from them also. That case is now going to the UK Supreme Court, and I do not expect them to win there either. I expect the same result to come out. What are we talking about? We're not talking about equal rights. We're talking about privilege. That's what political correctness is all about. It's about privilege. It's giving certain favored groups, supposedly groups that need protection, privilege over the majority. That's what it's all about. That's not equal rights. It's the very opposite of equal rights. Donald Trump's victory in America is a backlash. He's trumped this political correctness in a way. It's to that you can attribute Trump's victory. And of course, there are similar movements in Europe which oppose this type of privilege. That's what it's all about. There are many more examples. What I gave you is just one example because we have this ridiculous time limit of 7 minutes. But I've never been in a debate with such a ridiculously low time limit. But I can expand on it, hopefully, in the floor debate. Let me give you one more example. Justice Justice Clarence Thomas, the only black justice on the American Supreme Court, stuck a 15-cent discount sticker on his degree certificate from Yale because he said that is what his degree is worth, because he only got into Yale as a result of affirmative action, which means privilege. He was given a privileged position by being black. He didn't get there on merit. He was privileged, but he is honest enough to recognize that.
Thank you, Michael.
It's not right. And what that did...
Very privileged to hear you too,
yes,
but,
yes.
No, your time is up, I'm
Yes,
afraid.
I'm winding
it's
up,
time
I'm
to move
winding
on.
up.
It's time to move on to the floor debate.
What that means is that Clarence Thomas was privileged, but someone else, probably a white student, was therefore disadvantaged, was discriminated against, who should have had that place. That's what we are up against at the moment. The basic underlying values of Islam and underlying values of the West are not that different. They recognize the difference between male and female. They recognize marriage, traditional marriage between a man and a woman. They recognize differences between people. That's what's in common between Islam and the West. Those are our true values. If we got back to those, then there would be very little conflict between Islam and the West. But we've got this political correctness, which no one has voted for, that prevents us from expressing our own true values, and it's taken away our freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and many other freedoms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you to all our speakers. If we could put the house lights up now, please. Because this event is being live streamed, although the acoustic in here is very good, if anyone does want to speak, please wait for the very kind volunteer with the microphone to pass it to you so that you can be heard online. We're now going to have, I think, about an hour and a half, if there's enough interest. I suspect there will be, of question and answers and contributions as well, if you want to make a short speech from the floor or do both, which will then refer back to both sides of the panel should they wish to respond. So, if I could ask somebody, gentleman sitting there, please, in the third row from the front.
When Dr al-Hussaini had said that the scriptures are much the same in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, what we're failing to say is what's happened in practice is that Christianity and Judaism, certainly the lay versions of it, have abandoned their scriptures when it happens, for instance, on the debate on women priests. The scriptures are quite clear. It's been pointed out to me in the letter of Paul that there are not to be women leading the church. Nobody, not even those against women bishops, ever mentioned that. It's no longer a scriptural religion. It is what Anne-Marie said, make it up as you go along. Whereas, by contrast, Islam has become more scriptural. It used to be led by kings who weren't overbothered with the nuances and the actual scriptures of the Quran, but now imams are leading it, and they are ever more rigorous and insisting, and their congregations are, upon the literal meaning of this outdated text of the Dark Ages. So isn't that the real difference between the two, and why, if not in the past, now Islam has become irreconcilable with the modern West?
Thank you. Well, Mohammed, I think you better take that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. As I say, we had 7 minutes, so I couldn't get into a discussion about the hermeneutical side of things. Absolutely, the issue of irreconcilability in my view, my humble opinion, doesn't relate to the source materials, because the source materials in all three traditions have ambivalences, as all great world religions do. And that doesn't just apply to the Western religions like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, but also, we have other militaristic religions like Sikhism, for example, which is, you meet Sikhs and they're the most lovable people you can imagine these days. But in terms of the texts, you're quite, I would contend, the facts speak for themselves, that there are extremely violent passages in Islamic tradition and in the Judeo-Christian scriptures as well. And likewise, where there are passages that are misogynistic, supportive of slavery, supportive of genocide in the Islamic oral tradition, there are similar passages in rabbinic sources as well. Every great tradition no tradition has a monopoly on good or a monopoly on evil. There are ambivalences. That is the nature of a civilization. And as I said, just like Rome built aqueducts and the Colosseum, and at the same time the Pater Familias had the power of life and death over the newborn, every tradition has ambivalences. As in the West, I am horrified by a tradition, by a Western culture and civilization that can build so much humanity, advances in healthcare, compassion for the poor in many respects. But at the same time, the life of a person in Grenfell Tower or in a third world country, or indeed to a certain extent the life of the unborn, is considered to be of less value than somebody from a middle class North London background. So my whole position is that the texts, the source materials, are equally problematic in all three traditions. You pick up on the hermeneutics. That's absolutely the crux of what we're talking about here. Absolutely the crux of what we're talking about here. In the medieval period, when Muslims were talking to Jews and Christians, that's when there were advances in thinking, in philosophy, and in interpretation, creative ways of reading the text. This glass of water, is it kosher or is it treif? Is it halal or is it haram? Well, most people would say, well, it's completely halal to drink. But if you imagine somebody dying of thirst on the floor just there in front of you, is it still halal? Is it still kosher to drink or not, when that glass of water could save a life? The context in which we live has changed. The interpretative tradition needs to accommodate that change. And as you rightly say, there have been movements in both the Christian church and in the Jewish faith that have led to changes in the way that texts are applied. Rabbinic, I quoted Deuteronomy chapter 20 there. When Joshua went into Jericho, the scripture says he killed every living thing, men, women, children, cattle, sheep, donkeys. We see all these texts about murdering on a grand scale, about the stoning of the contumacious child, the stoning for adultery. It's gone in Judaism, it's been transmitted, and it still continues in Islam. So, as you quite rightly say, it's the interpretation that is the crux of our question at this time. And we live in a medievalist environment in Islamdom. The only way that we can advance is when we give up the idea that, somehow Islam is completely other, but rather re-engage that conversation in the West with our Christian, Jewish, and indeed other partners, and enable that interpretative advance to take place. And that's what I've been fighting for. And as you rightly say, there are traditions in all three that are extremist. We have a much larger proportion of extremists in Islamdom at the moment than in, for example, the fringe groups in Judaism and elsewhere. We need to move forward.
Thank you, Mohammed. And before we move back to the question, if I could just, Alan, I saw you shaking your head a couple of times there. You're probably the right person, certainly insofar as Christianity was mentioned. I just wondered if you'd respond to the point Mohammed was making about
and also to the gentleman
hermeneutic equivalence, and his slightly different point about the divergence between scripture and practice in Christianity as opposed to Islam as well. I wonder how you would deal with both of those.
But I alluded to it. The genius of Christianity is that and the genius, therefore, behind Western civilization is it isn't Judaism and it isn't Islam. Let's understand Judaism as described in the Old Testament, okay, which for Christians is descriptive and not prescriptive, is a theocracy. Doesn't matter whether it's Moses or whether it's who went to war, whether it's David who went to war, it was a theocracy. Islam, 600 years after Christianity, is a theocracy. It's rules and regulations. It's Sharia law. So you've got the Old Testament rules and regulations brought about by Moses. You've got Islamic ones. In the middle of that, along comes Jesus Christ. As I was saying beforehand, along comes Jesus Christ, and he simply says it isn't about any rules and regulations. In fact, he was in opposition. He was strung up on the cross because he opposed the rules and regulations of the Jews, and he said, actually, it's about something else. He said there's a basic law. The basic law is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He said to a rich guy, he said, if you follow that, you'll be doing well. It is about relationship. It's about a person. It's not about rules and regulations. We come out for it. Now, of course, it is true that there's a debate about interpretation. It is true. But Christianity is far more flexible, and that is the genius behind Western civilization. It isn't primarily about obeying the literalistic laws. It's first of all about relationship and worshipping God. And that's why in the West we were able to quite happily separate the church and the state. As I said earlier, give unto Caesar the things that Caesar said, Jesus, and to God the things that are God. Much more flexible. So the whole issue about interpretation and minutiae of the law disappeared under Christianity, and that is what has given the West its creativity, its flexibility, its ability to flower and flourish rather than be crushed by the law and by the rules and the regulations. That is the huge difference.
Thanks. Thank you, Alan. Again, just briefly before returning to the gentleman who asked the question, does that not imply, for the purposes of tonight's debate, that Judaism, by that logic, would also be irreconcilably different from the West?
Yeah, for those that follow it, if they took the Old Testament as prescriptive, which Christians don't, some Jews do, but many don't, but if they took it as prescriptive, yes, it would be incompatible, because it's all about laws and rules and regulations. Christianity came out of Judaism. Jesus was in opposition to the Jewish authorities who wanted their rules and regulations. What could you do on the Sabbath? Well, Jesus said you can do anything. If you're looking after your loving your neighbor, you can do whatever you like on the Sabbath. So that's what the crux of the whole thing was. That is the genius, and that is the genius behind the Western civilization.
Thank you. To the gentleman who asked the question, I think you still have the microphone. What do you make of those answers, sir?
Well, the problem with what Dr al-Hussaini says is that very, very few Muslims, especially professing ones, would agree with him. They want the more literal interpretation, and that is what's being imposed upon the West, including inferior rights for women, in prohibitions, not even the freedom to criticize the religion, as Anne-Marie Waters found with trying to exhibit cartoons against Muhammad. Now in the West, we had a slight debate over 30 years ago with the life of Brian. And the few who wanted to stop it, it got nowhere, and it was shown in all the cinemas. That's inconceivable in any true Muslim country.
Thank you. Let's have the next question. Gentleman in the second row, just in front there, put his hand up first. Thanks.
Hello, thank you very much, everybody. First of all, the Crusades were mentioned. Now, of course, the Crusades were a defensive action by Christians in Europe at the time against incursions into Jerusalem by Muslims, by Islam. And actually, if you look at the 1400-year history of Islam, whether it's, for example, the Battle of Roncesvalles in 778, where Charlemagne, Carlos Magnus defeated the Saracens, the Muslims as they were then known, that gave rise, incidentally, to the Chanson de Roland, which is the oldest surviving text in French literature, or indeed, for example, the Battle of Vienna in 1683, when John Sobieski, who was king of Poland at the time, forced back invading Muslim Islamic army, conquering Europe. These battles, as indeed were the Crusades, were all defensive actions. Secondly, the other point I wanted to make On the Sheikh Dr. Muhammad al-Hussaini talked about interpretation and interpreting religious texts. As Anne-Marie Waters correctly said, the religion is based objectively on the text. It is an objective text. It is not subjective. It is there, what is in writing. Obviously, it can be translated, and words, to a certain extent, have a little bit of dexterity around them. But essentially, the text is there. It's in writing. If not in stone, it's very clear. Of course, things can be interpreted, but what we're really talking about is not the interpretation of the Quran, Islamic texts, but we're talking about the observance. And I think that's a very important distinction. The fact that we had a situation in the past, many years, where Christian Old Testament texts in the Bible were were observed literally. They were taken literally and put into practice. For example, the Leviticus, which condemns homosexuality, very clearly laid rise to legislative laws in Europe and Christendom, which penalized sodomy, male homosexual acts. But we've since no longer observed those Christian foundation roots. We now obviously have, in my view, a very enlightened society where we don't treat people based on, don't condemn people based on their sexuality to death or imprison them. Conversely, all the countries where homosexuality still is punishable by death or indeed imprisonment are all Muslim countries. And what does that tell you?
I'm not sure that is strictly true, but I think the point's well made.
That is strictly true.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mohammed, obviously there is a sort of reiteration to some extent of the theological points that were made by the last questioner.
Sure.
But there was also the first part of the gentleman's question about the history.
Yep.
And that goes back to what you were saying about exceptionalism and
Yes.
whether there is a particular history with Islam. So I wonder if you'd like to respond to that first, please.
Sure, certainly. In relation to the history, Islam's ghazawat, its conquering pattern of spreading, of building the Islamic Empire, is part of that history. When the Khalifa, the third Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, conquered Jerusalem, there is a celebrated account which shows how he allowed freedom of religion to the Christian communities and refused to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or indeed in front of the Holy Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in order to avoid a situation where Muslims would, in years thereafter, destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because the Caliph had prayed there. He expelled the Jews at the request of the Christians, most reluctantly. That same Caliph who supported religious freedom is the same Caliph who also expelled Jews and Christians from the peninsula of the Arabian Peninsula. So again, it comes down to that ambivalent history. The same prophet the founding prophet of Islam, that welcomed a delegation of Christians from Najran and allowed those Christians to pray in the mosque, in the prophet's own mosque, to celebrate Christian practice within that mosque. That same prophet was also responsible for the expulsion and the destruction of the Banu Qurayza under his command. So, like all traditions, there is the ambivalence. The idea that the Crusades were purely defensive, I defer to other historians. When the Crusaders came into Jerusalem, they slaughtered every single one of the Jews. And it is a dark chapter in the interpretation of Christianity. I would say that the Crusaders' reading of those texts, the literalist reading of those texts, is a legitimate reading of the Christian faith, as legitimate as the Daesh and ISIS and other extremist groups. Alan's argument presents the case that Jesus Christ came to oppose Judaic law and Judaic scripture. Jesus' commitment was to the fulfillment of Jewish law and Jewish scripture through himself, through the Word made flesh, and a novel interpretation of that text that enabled the disciples to break the Sabbath under certain circumstances for reasons of charity and for reasons of moral compassion. It is a moving forward of the Judaic interpretation, part of a Judeo-Christian tradition. And I would be horrified if this debate took the view that Judaism is not compatible with Western civilization, since Judaism has informed Western civilization as much as it has informed Islamic civilization. In terms of violence, well, just look at Latin America, Catholic to the core, and how the conquistadors destroyed and committed mass genocide in the pursuit of their evangelism. So we have enough evil to go round. That's my point. We have enough evil to go round in my tradition, in your tradition. There is no monopoly on righteousness, no monopoly on goodness, no monopoly on evil. And that is the nature of all all religious traditions. And I'd say in this secular environment, you know, let's not allow the secularists to sit on their laurels. The 20th century is a tribute, an absolute altar to mass genocide by fascism, communism, and other secular ideologies. Nobody has a monopoly on righteousness. Nobody has a monopoly on evil.
Thank you. Thank you. Before going over to the proposition for their response, hopefully we'll be sticking to this subject for a minute longer if we go to the lady, the second row from the back, please, who had her hand up a minute ago. Yes, you, madam, please.
Thank you. I'm an atheist, so I have no dog in the scriptural fight at all. But I do think there are significant differences. The key point for me is that wonderful phrase that has done so much good work. It may well just be there because the people who wrote it were trying to sweeten up the Romans who were in control at the time, and they didn't want them to think that they were like the Jews who were going to rise up against them or anything. That's very possible. But that phrase of rendering unto Caesar has done enormous work, and it's been the basis of our movement to a state that is free of theocracy. And over time, over a long period of time, with scientific knowledge gaining and enlightenment values and just the work of people trying out ideas in an increasingly free society, we reached the sunlit uplands, really, which we only really reached in the 60s when I was young. And we got to the point where people actually owned their own bodies, even if they went to bed with somebody of the same sex, which is how it should be. And we started to have respect for other people and the right to live their lives, as long as they didn't cause any harm to others. We took a leaf out of J.S. Mill's book, and I think things were pretty damn fine. And that meant that we also had respect for people of different faiths, provided they were peaceable and lived properly with us, respecting the rights of other individuals. And we did get equality under the law. After a considerable period of time, we got equality under the law. And that has indeed been disrupted by political correctness and by the undermining of our law by certain amendments to the law that have actually instilled an inequality in the law. And I agree with your point about the bakers in Ireland, totally right, and I do hope that gets overturned. But I think that we had achieved that point. We were virtually on the point of regarding every individual as an equal and a person who was to live their life freely as long as they didn't harm or coerce others. But I think with Islam, the key point there, and I have read the scriptures, and I have read a great deal about the history of Islam, and I went into it initially as a sort of, Pigeon Street sort of very jolly person who thought, well, I'll just learn a lot about religion, it'll all be lovely. And I found out that for me, even more than the Quran, the key point is the figure of Muhammad, who, unlike Jesus, was not peaceful, who conquered with a sword called the divider of vertebrae, who forced people into submission to himself and his new ideology. And for me, that figure, never mind about all the arguments about, there's lots of rubbish in the Bible. I know there's an awful lot of killing and all that, but that's the key point. The key point is render unto Caesar and the opposing force of a figure that forced submission to theocracy.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Michael to my left is keen to speak, and I think on the point about equality and the evolution of rights, he should do so. But first, I would like to go to the proposition for their take on the historical angle of this, because I think you're really adding from maybe a Douglas Murray type Christian atheist perspective to what Muhammad was saying, and suggesting that while maybe Islam and the West have irreconcilable differences, once upon a time, maybe as far back as the 1950s, so did other faiths. So maybe it's a question of those irreconcilable differences not really being irreconcilable over time. I wonder if Anne-Marie or Alan would like to speak to that.
I think I'd like to stick to my thesis that ultimately, because the West has benefited from all sorts of things. Douglas Murray will argue a lot of it benefited from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. The Enlightenment was of huge benefit to the West and so on. But I'd like to stick to my thesis that the basic cradle of our society was Christianity. You don't have to be a Christian yourself to recognize that, and the majority of people in society these days aren't. But that is the cradle. And I have to come back to the point, and I can only see it in these terms. Of course, we can do exactly what Muhammad was doing a moment ago and say, well, what about this bit of history? And he will raise, like many Muslims will raise about the Crusades. I cannot condone the Crusades as carried out in the name of Christ. And I can be absolutely clear that Jesus Christ himself would not condone them. Why? Because he said those that live by the sword will die by the sword. And on the one occasion, one of his disciples drew the sword, he told him to put it away. He was not a man of violence. He never wanted to be violent. And that is underpinning. So that's why we have in our Western society, we have a very strong pacifist Christian strain within it. Now, we can go back over 2,000 years of history and say, and look at all the blots and bad things that Christians have done in the name of Christianity. Yeah, that's true. And that all the good things or bad things have been done in the name of Islam, and that's true too. The only way you can decide whether it's intrinsic to that particular faith tradition is by going down to the foundation documents. And that's where I would stand. If you go back and you compare, quite simply compare Jesus Christ, who's had so much influence on the Western world, and Muhammad, who's had so much influence on the Islamic world, and look at their teachings and their own lifestyle and so on, if you go back to that, game, set, and match to Jesus. And it has to be. Do you know... Do you know anybody who criticizes Jesus? They don't, because he was the perfect man. You can say, well, he was a bit deluded because he thought he was a son of God. If you're not a Christian, you'll think that. But what did he do that was harmful to anybody? Oh, I know. He overturned the tables, didn't he? With anger, he was furious. He overturned the tables in the temple. What else did he do that was wrong? He healed people. He spoke the truth as he understood it. He took on the religious authorities deliberately in the end. And when instead of escaping from them, he walked straight into it, and he was struck up on a cross. Now look at Muhammad. Do I need to say much about Muhammad? He himself was a man, amongst other things, he was a brilliant man, an outstanding man, but he was also a man of war. He also was not beyond having people that criticized him assassinated. You look at the man and look at his lifestyle, look at his teaching, look at the Quran, and you look at Jesus. I'm afraid it is game, set, and match to Jesus. And he is one of the key foundation stones to our Western civilization. I'm not decrying the contributions of ancient Greeks and ancient Rome. I'm not decrying the Enlightenment, all of which were very valuable, but that is it. So you have to look at those two people, especially now, and that I have to say, the two are completely incompatible.
Can I just add?
Thank you, Alan. Yep. Just before we do so, if I'm reading what your original question was, one of the points you were making is that in addition to the division between church and state that you find in Christian scripture, there was also a long-standing period of evolution. You mentioned the Enlightenment, you mentioned the 1960s.
Yeah.
Is that...
But that actually was only possible because of that division which had already begun to be enshrined. And on the point about Christ and about Jesus, that is, I call him Christ, and Muhammad, there's quite an argument for Jesus never having existed. I don't know either way. It doesn't matter to me. What matters is the fact that that figure is peaceful. That figure didn't espouse violence and said that politics and faith should be separate, and was an entirely peaceful person, which is why, as has been stated, pacifism is a strong element in Christianity. Now, the figure of Muhammad, if you read Tom Holland, he was never anywhere near Mecca, never anywhere Medina, and he actually wasn't the figure in the Surah at all. So the Surah is possibly
that is moving
fictional,
slightly on
but it doesn't matter, because
a
what
different
matters
area.
is what the scriptures say about this figure, and this figure is extremely violent. He conquered and forced people into submission, and that has been the pattern ever since.
Okay.
That is the distinguishing feature.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of people at the front with their hands up. And before I go to them, I'd just like to ask Michael, given that the lady's question strayed very much into the territory of your opening speech, you were criticising the idea that we live in a utopia of equal rights and values. How would you respond to that interpretation?
I would just say, is this on? This business about equality of rights, equal rights, doesn't exist now with political correctness. And, I was expecting the other side to defend the present Western society, but I'm amazed that we've got one person here who's talking about tradition of Christianity. Christianity, I certainly sympathize with the Christian bakers in Belfast, but Christianity has been terrifically intolerant. Christianity demands that you believe in it as the only truth. And not just that, but that particular brand of Christianity. To this day, since 1054, there's a split in Christianity between East and West. Why? On a doctrinal point. Our friend here was saying Christianity doesn't depend on law. It depends very much on law. The word filioque, I wonder if he even knows what that means. It means from the Son. Why? Because the doctrine in the Western Church was that the Holy Ghost, or the Holy Spirit, was descended from the Father and from the Son. Filioque means and from the Son. Whereas in the Eastern Church, they said, no, the Holy Ghost comes only from the Father. Well, where's the proof for that? None. But there's still a schism in the church 1,000 years later. Jan Hus, the first reformer, was burnt at the stake in Prague in the year 1415 because he dared to disagree with the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther happened to have some very, very powerful backers, and he escaped. They were going to do the same to him. Jan Hus was burnt. Martin Luther was invited to the Diet of Worms, and don't worry, he himself would have been the feast for worms had he lingered any longer, but he disappeared quickly because he had some princes of North Germany who protected him. Otherwise, the same fate would have befallen him. Christianity has been terrifically intolerant throughout. Queen Mary of England burnt at the stake the Archbishop of Canterbury and 2 other bishops, together with a multitude of others. Why? Because they dared to differ from her Catholicism. That's all. Her doctrine. So don't tell me law doesn't count for anything Christianity. Christianity is terrifically intolerant. Now, here's where there's a very, very important distinction that I haven't mentioned and that hasn't been mentioned, and I don't think our friend on the other side, the Christian, would know about this. The difference between... Well, I'm sure he wouldn't.
I know all about filioque.
The difference...
I know all about it.
No. The difference between creed religions and communal religions. Creed religions say, this is our belief. Christianity is one of them. Islam is another. Believe in this, or you're wrong, or possibly we kill you. Either you join us or we kill you. Christianity is one of those. Islam is another. Judaism is not. Judaism, when have you had someone knock on your door and say, please convert to Judaism? Never. Judaism is a communal religion. You belong to you are Jewish because you belong to the community. Hinduism is another of those. Have you ever been approached by someone to convert to Hinduism? No. You can't even do so if you want to. Shinto, the religion of Japan, is another. There are these American keen Japanophiles who go to Japan. How can I become a priest of Shinto? The Japanese are nonplussed. No, you can't become a priest of Shinto. You can't be an adherent of Shinto. You can't even become a citizen of Japan unless you are Japanese. It's a communal religion. It may seem exclusive, but it's more tolerant in that way because it's not forcing anyone to accept something which they don't want to accept.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you. Thank you for opening up a rerun of 1054 between the different sides of the table over the filioque, which is impressive. The lady here at the front has had her hand up for a very long time. If I could ask her to speak, and then we'll move to, and the gentleman at the front, and then we'll move to Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much. This question is to Michael, because you seem to have said very little about Islam at all. I don't know if you have children, but when it comes down to it, if you had a daughter, would you rather she lived in a Muslim-majority country or the West? Thank you.
That was, the question there was, if you had a daughter, would you rather she lived in an Islamic country or the West?
Well, I think that would be up to her. I mean...
Okay.
What would you prefer?
Okay.
As a father.
I don't think it's right to force people. This is why...
I think...
What would you prefer as a father?
This is why certain Christian sects or groups don't believe in infant baptism because
would you rather she lived in a Muslim-majority country or the West?
That you should not force your religion on your child. So, for example,
that's not what I'm asking. I believe you're a professional.
Really?
Please answer my question.
Well, your question. I have answered your question.
No, you haven't.
It would be up to her to decide, and I mean, the thing is that it depends which Islamic society you're talking about. Are you talking about Abu Dhabi? Are you talking about Dubai? Are you talking about Morocco? Or are you talking about Saudi Arabia, where she wouldn't be allowed to drive a car? Now she is. There's a big difference. These countries have different traditions which aren't necessarily to do with Islam. For example, female genital mutilation, which is often blamed on Islam, actually is not to do with Islam. It's an African tradition. And it's been taken over by a lot of Islamic countries, but not all.
I hope Turkey, you do not have any daughters.
I would say a country like Turkey, a country like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, the UAE, it'd be perfectly fine for a girl to grow up there. But Saudi Arabia, maybe not. Egypt, possibly not.
Thank you, Mark. I think that's... I think that's as far as we're going to get from Michael for the moment on that question. I'm sure Anne-Marie might have something further to say on that subject more broadly. But first, if we could go to the gentleman in the front, please, who also had his hand up. The gentleman with the beard right in the front there. Yep, thank you. Sorry, it's the house lights aren't up fully. I apologise.
Hello. There's a massive elephant in the room, and we want to talk about Islam now, not about Judaism 1,500 years ago, which I know about it. I want to talk about Islam now, what's happening now, FGM, the Muslim rape gangs, and they are Muslim rape gangs, Sharia, halal, that's been forced down my throat. My daughter's 16. She goes to a mixed school. Her 16-year-old friends who are male from Muslim families believe, they're born here, more British than me because I was born in South America, that gays should be thrown off a building. They were born in this country. That is their belief from their parents and the mosque. That's what's happening in Britain. And you, with your Judaism, and you, with your cherry-picking Irish gay cake, which doesn't really have any relevance, you're not answering any questions. And that's what's happening in this country. And the majority of us here, in this room, are really worried. I'm an immigrant, 43 years from South America. I can go on about the Spanish until you're blue in the face. Yeah. I don't care. I live peacefully with the Spanish. Sure. But the problem that we have now is with Islam and the extreme Muslims, because I know some Muslims who do not agree with that. But you're not addressing that. You're telling me about Judaism and the Deuteronomy and Filioque or whatever. It doesn't have any bearing on what's happening now.
Well,
on the jihadists who shout, Allahu Akbar. What do you say to that?
We will. And just to be clear, we will move on to Anne-Marie first, then I'll ask Mohammed to respond. But just to be clear, I think that part of the discussion we've just had was about the issue of irreconcilable differences.
I
The question I
understand,
was
yeah, of
putting to
course.
Alan, yes, we can make those points about the here and now, but is this something that can be reconciled over time? Anne-Marie.
Yeah, thank you. You took the words out of my mouth. There is a theological debate to be had, but we also have to have a debate about today. And the question I want to answer is whether Islam today is compatible with the West today. What happened 1,000 years ago doesn't matter to us today. It's a debate only. It's a discussion only. And what I am saying, and like was said down here, I will learn about this religion through two things. Its core texts and observing it. And in both aspects, it comes up as a violent, oppressive, totalitarian religion in both theory and in practice. We can see it all over the world. We don't have to estimate, we don't have to guess, we don't have to wonder or speculate. We can see it. We know what it does everywhere it has power, and we know what it does when it moves west as well, because the same things are happening here. There are a couple of things that I want to go back over, because we've heard quite a lot since I last spoke. I want to start with the cherry-picking comment. Now, if you pick cherries out of something, they must be in there in the first place. Now, if I am able to pick horrors out of Islam, it's because they are in there in the first place. And it's the fact that they are in there that I condemn it and will not apologize for doing so. I'm not any kind of theologian, but I do know, and it was said over here and I wrote it down, source materials are equally problematic. No, they are not equally problematic. Yes, religions have things in common, but those things, if they are compatible, then they're not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're here to talk about the irreconcilable differences. And no matter how many things we have in common, those irreconcilable differences are still there. And they happen to be the most profoundly important ones, like our right to speak our minds or change our religion. So they are not all problematic. And from a person who is not a theologian, I do know that Muhammad, the Quran, commands holy war against the unbeliever until all religion is for Allah. That is written in the Quran. And I know that Muhammad was a warrior and a warlord. We know this. He killed people. So Jesus did not do any of those. And I'm not religious. I have no horse in this race. But that is observable reality from reading the core text of both of these religions. But even they're not alike. But even if they were, and as you have argued, some of the things are similar. We are living in 2017, and it's 2017 that matters. And the West we are talking about now doesn't take or use any terrible things that may be written in the Old Testament and place them into our laws today. There may be stoning in the Old Testament, but there is no stoning in Western society today, and that is what we are talking about. We are talking about the West, and it isn't compatible. It's been said that nobody has a monopoly on righteousness. Now, again, this is distraction. And it's the same distraction we see when we ignore Islam and start talking about how awful the West is. And how an accidental fire in London demonstrates how awful the West is. It's a distraction. It distracts us from looking at Islam, which is what we are here to talk about. And furthermore, nobody is saying that anyone has a monopoly on righteousness. I specified more than once that we are not perfect. Nobody is perfect, but that's not the question we're answering. We weren't here to answer the question, is any society perfect? We're here to answer whether Islam is compatible with Western society, and I believe that we've shown that it isn't. You said you don't think it's right to force people. Well, then you should surely be condemning the practice of Islam all over the world. It is perfect at forcing people. It imposes the death penalty on any complaint or any criticism. And finally, FGM. FGM is not an African practice. It is practiced in countries outside of Africa, including in Indonesia, where it is growing, and it is growing in other non-African countries as well. It is endorsed by the Muslim Brotherhood. When they took power in Egypt after the Arab Spring, it was a priority to them. They had mobile FGM units going around the country. It is also justified in almost everywhere it is practiced by Islamic clerics and defended as an Islamic practice, and the reason for that is that it does appear and is sanctioned in the Islamic hadiths. So those of us who know that fact, and if you want to see it, you look at the Islamic hadiths for yourself and see that they are sanctioned in there. Not all Muslims do it because not all Muslims accept those hadiths. That doesn't mean they're not there, and that doesn't mean they're not the reason that Islamic clerics can continue to sustain FGM the world over. The question is, once again, is Islam compatible with the West? The answer is clearly no.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Before going back to the floor, I'd just like to ask Mohammed to reply to some of that criticism of his argument, and for Michael briefly on the point of freedom of speech as well that's been made.
Thank you for all your points. If anybody knows anything about me, you'll know that I've been one of the most vocal critics of Islam and Islamic practice as it is currently in large swathes of the Muslim world, from my work campaigning against persecution of Christian minorities to issues around the implementation of extreme forms of Sharia punishment and so forth. And in fact, Alan and Anne-Marie are friends and colleagues of mine, and we've worked together on different issues. So we're not here to have a point-scoring match about the West as it is now and Islam as it is now. Our starting point, our very starting point, is there is a massive problem with the Muslim world in the present time, and the question is, are the core ideologies so irreconcilable that we can't solve this problem? There are two approaches to that. One is to say, absolutely, it's irreconcilable. The only way is to build great big walls and barriers and ban Muslims and all this kind of thing. The other solution is to recognize the realities of history, that we were all in that same place because our traditions are deeply intertwined. We have all the same crap in our history, in Western history, that we currently have in Islam. And to look for solutions from the reality that it is when one helping hand from one part of the world, from one civilization, lent support to another civilization in building an intellectual conversation that enabled those civilizations to move forward. There were times in history when Islam was way more enlightened and more supportive of human rights and religious freedom than in the dark ages of medieval Europe with pogroms and massive anti-Semitism. The tables have turned now, and now this is an environment where there is massive intolerance. There was a time when just as in tribal societies, women had more rights, primitive Amazonian tribal societies, women had more rights than they did in Victorian England. Societies have moved forward. So where women had the right to divorce many centuries before they had the right to divorce under English law, the situation for women now in the Islamic world is absolutely ghastly. It is terrible. The question is, how do we find a solution to this reality that we have in the world today? The question before this debate is Islam just utterly other? Is it completely disconnected to the West? Is it just a completely different belief system that has nothing to do with the West? I would argue no, actually the reality is it's very similar. We're simply looking in an hourglass at medieval Europe, medieval Christendom with medieval Christendom values. And if Christendom can make that journey, then so can Islamdom with the help of Christendom. And the thing that really disturbs me today is the idea that Judaism, in its core halachic beliefs, there are Jewish communities here that are deeply observant and are generally quite isolationist they are also problematic. That is the pathway to fascism, and exactly the same way that you talk about Islam's prophet being a martial leader. There are martial leaders all the way through the Old Testament versus a spiritual leader, a saintly leader like Jesus Christ. And it was exactly that same kind of argument that Moses and Joshua, these Jewish leaders, were martial and violent, whereas Jesus represented a Christian value. That led to what we saw in Positivus Christentum between 1933 and 1945 in Germany, and supported all that kind of alienation of Jewish people and ultimately that kind of destruction. So, as I say, we are owning the evil, the wickedness in Islamdom today, and indeed in the behavior and the conduct of Muslim minorities living in the West. We are owning that. We are saying that is how it is, sir. You asked that question. I'm saying absolutely guilty as charged. The question is, how do we move forward from that? Are our ideologies so fundamentally different that we can't do anything about it other than send me back to where my parents or grandparents came from? Me, Or are we saying that actually our civilizations can learn from one another and we can give a helping hand and move forward on these questions?
I think to be fair, the points are very well made about future progress that might be made, but I think to be fair, nobody has tried to make the association between extremist Islamic belief and yourself or anyone else specific this evening. Before I go back to the floor, in fact, there are lots of hands up. The point has come up again. I think it is worth spending some time on about freedom of speech. And Anne-Marie mentioned we have, as a modern Western freedom, the right to say whatever we like. And Michael, this is something that you were very much taking issue with earlier.
Yeah, well, that is supposedly a fundamental right in the West, and of course it's enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. You can read about it in my book on human rights, where I also make clear that right is actually gone now. For example, I gave you that example about the support gay marriage, cake, but in many other respects also. For example, Professor Larry Summers, president of Harvard University, very distinguished economist, happened to mention at a conference the problem of women in the higher reaches of science and engineering at universities. And he gave several alternative explanations, one of which was that women weren't as good at mathematics and that sort of thinking as men were, as a possible explanation. My goodness, what a storm broke over his head. He had to resign as president of Harvard. That's the degree of freedom of speech one has today. He had facts and figures based on school results and many other things, school grades from America, all sorts of things, to show that was a possible explanation. It's surely up to the individual to be able to say that. No, he lost his position as president of Harvard. But at least there he was able to come back subsequently, I'm glad to say, and is now a professor at Harvard again. The same tolerance hasn't been shown here. Although Larry Summers lost his position, he would have been appointed by Obama as Secretary of the Treasury. He lost that. But, for example, here, not a million miles from where I'm sitting here, Professor Sir Tim Hunt was kicked out of University College London for making this remark about his own personal experience in the laboratories. He's a very, very famous Nobel Prize winner, and he made the point that in a science laboratory, women tend to be more emotional than men. Oh my God, how can you say that? And he used this light-hearted phrase, that when you criticize them, they cry, oh, how dare he? And he had to resign. He was threatened. You resign or we dismiss you.
Okay, thank you. I think that point's very well made. Well, I would say that we are having this debate in London, whatever our faults are, of course. We wouldn't be able to have it in Riyadh. We have... Gentlemen, just to go to somebody nearer the back, there's a gentleman in a dark shirt who's had his hand up for a long time. Yes, you, sir, please. Thank you for waiting for the microphone, but we do have to do that.
You mentioned...
sorry, I did mean the gentleman just behind you. He was, about 10 minutes ago. He was... thank you. We'll come back to you in a minute.
Yes, I'm having a little difficulty understanding Dr. al-Hussaini's position. The issue that we're debating is Islam consistent with the West and liberal democracy? Your argument, sir, seems to be that you don't hide away from all the bad parts of Islam, but Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they're all much of a muchness. If Christianity and Judaism are consistent with Western values, then so must we. Perhaps I'm simplifying it, but that seems to be where you're going. And then to justify that they're all much of a muchness, you hark back to the Old Testament. Well, if I can say, sir, that there are at least 5 reasons why that argument simply doesn't hold water. The Old Testament, the old Mosaic law, never ever applied to anyone other than the Jewish people. The most literal biblical reader would say that never applied to the Gentiles. Secondly, that's the Old Testament. It's now been replaced by the New Testament. We've got a new covenant in Jesus' crucifixion. So if you're a Christian and you believe, the old Mosaic law has been left behind anyway. Thirdly, even if it's still applied, Jesus said it's been overruled by the one commandment that we have to love God and love one another, and that trumps everything else. Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Fourthly, in the Bible itself, in the Acts of the Apostles, St. Peter and St. Paul, they debate the issue, and they come to the conclusion that the old Mosaic law isn't binding on Gentiles who are Christians. So even if you believe in the Bible, it says in the Bible itself, for Christians, says the Mosaic law doesn't apply. And fifthly, not one single church, to my knowledge, since the 1st century, has ever tried to claim that Christians are bound by the old Mosaic law. Now, I've been going to church all my life. I've never once heard either my church or any other church of any other denomination say that Christians are bound to follow the old Mosaic law. That's why we eat bacon sarnies. That's why we don't get circumcised. That's why we don't observe the old Jewish feasts. So the argument that because it's in the Bible we're all much of a muchness totally ignores the role of the New Testament and the role of Jesus. Now, a few years ago...
Sorry, we have heard that question put a number of ways.
That's right. So I'd like to get back to what the motion today is all about, which is Islam, which seems to have been completely ducked so far for about 3/4 of the evening. A few years ago, I read the Quran, and the Quran explicitly promotes robbery, holy war, the enslavement, killing, and even rape of captives. It promotes misogyny, different rights for women, wife beating, amputation, torture, a whole lot, slavery. And for Muslims, they follow that. So if we were to rephrase, if we just slightly tweak the title to the debate to make it slightly more precise, if the question under debate here this evening was, is Islam, as it is written in the Quran and as it was practiced by Muhammad, is that consistent with Western democracy? Would you simply say, no, it isn't?
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting rephrasing. Of course, that isn't the question that we're asking, which is part of the point. Mohammed, can you find an equivalence for all these awful things the gentleman mentions with other faiths, or is this really a case of Islamic exceptionalism?
It comes back to that question of Islam being unique and different when it just simply isn't. The question is Islam irreconcilable with Western civilization? Not, is Islam irreconcilable with a particular interpretation of Christianity? When I hear some of my Christian brothers and sisters talking about their Christian faith, it reminds me of the way that Muslims talk about Islam. There is this Islam of the air, which some of you may have encountered actually. Well, you know, Islam as it's practiced. Islam as it's practiced in Saudi Arabia, that's a Muslim state. Oh, but it's not. What about Iran? That's an Islamic state. Oh, but it's not. There is this kind of mythical notion of this ideal utopian Islam. Well, I would say that the Christians are just as guilty of that. Because whereas Christians are no doubt very, very married to the New Testament, I find with some distaste actually sometimes and some frustration that you treat the Old Testament as some kind of mistress. You'll jump into bed with her when it suits you to quote from her to support a particular position, such as in the past, you used to support enslavement of African people using that Bible, and indeed using St. Paul, wives be obedient to your husbands, slaves obey your masters. You used your text in exactly the same way, but other times you distance yourself from, but that's all Jewish stuff. That's just Jewish stuff, and Jesus came to repeal the law. So it's kind of moving goalposts sometimes talking to Christians in much the same way that you might find it frustrating talking to your Muslim dialogue partners when they're constantly moving the goalposts and saying, well, this hadith doesn't apply, or this, The fact is we all have stuff in our source material, the Bible as the inerrant word of God, not the New Testament as the inerrant word of God, the Bible as the inerrant word of God according to conservative evangelical teaching. We have the case of Western civilization please allow me to answer the question. We have the case of Western civilization not being a Christian civilization, but a Judeo-Christian civilization, a Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman civilization that has drawn upon all these different sources. And likewise, the idea that somehow Christian civilization is Western civilization is just patently not true. You just have to read Luther's Jews and Their Lies and his view about what Jewish people are about to understand what the reformers, the founders of Western Protestantism were about. You have to see the case of John Calvin, Calvinist churches all over the world, whom burned Michael Servetus for his heresy. You have to read Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, what their views about religious freedom were, when they talk about the view that heretics should not just be condemned in the hereafter, but also burned and removed from life in the present.
Thank you. I think that side of the point is very well made. I'll go to the proposition in a moment, the gentleman's question to me at least spoke to, can you find any equivalents? Can you give us some examples of high-profile, current, influential, doctrinal disavowal of some of the things that he raises within Islam?
About,
some of the things you mentioned, robbery, slavery, some of these things.
You
go back to Christianity and to Judaism and you say these things have been renounced by various people. Where are the Islamic equivalents of these people?
Well, what I'm saying is that within the Quranic text, just like within the Hebrew Bible, there are commandments supporting slavery. And in fact, what we're seeing in the present time is a view in from Saudi sheikhs that says that we're not fully Muslims until we reintroduce slavery. But the fact is, for many centuries, slavery was abandoned by the officialdom of Islam, even though slavery continued. And I would say, in relation to the question of giving unto Caesar and Christianity is not a violent religion. You can talk about the Christianity of the air the same way you can talk about the Islam of the air. You can read the Sermon on the Mount. For us as non-Christians, we don't really care. What we care about is how Christendom has treated us over centuries, with the role of the church, not acting as a committer of violence by proxy. Yes, you don't drop bombs. But you bless the bombs. Army chaplains bless those bombs. The priests on both sides, the King of France is supported by God. The King of England is supported by God. And Christians are fighting each other and indeed waging war on each other. Yes, Christians don't take up arms in the name of the Pope anymore, but the Christian establishment, just like Pharaoh's priests, support the military-industrial complex. And many Christians, such as my friends from the Quaker movement, they reject that kind of Christianity. The fact is that we are in a situation where the vast majority of Islamdom has not caught up with the way that Judaism, which is closer to Islam than Christianity, Judaism has learnt from the Christian Enlightenment and has moved forward. So the great majority of Islamdom still remains within that medieval Christian mindset.
I would just like once more before going over to Alan and Anne-Marie and then back to the floor. This is an opportunity for you to put your case, really,
Yeah, sure.
I think. I mean, I'm no expert in hermeneutics and theology, but I can, for example, point to 16th century papal decrees against slavery, to take one example.
Exactly.
I mean, what are the equivalent kind of decrees in the Muslim world? I mean, just sort of 2 or 3 examples
Absolutely.
of
Well, the
people
fatwas,
moving away
exactly.
from the scripture.
In terms of movement forward, some of the work that we've been doing, for example, one of the key things related, 2 areas, one is slavery and the other is apostasy. Apostasy still, applied in significant areas of the Muslim world where people who convert from Islam to another religion are murdered, basically. There have been significant statements by Muslim leaders saying certainly from Al-Azhar Sharif, my alma mater, and elsewhere, that have committed themselves to the view that these are practices of their time. That, for example, the change of religion does not apply to a conscientious change of belief from being a Muslim to accepting Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior and believing in His divinity and all. It also applies to it includes in it a waging of war, a treasonable offence, at a time when religion and national identity were very, very closely intertwined. So there are small movements, but the point is we're just talking about a flickering flame. My whole point is that we are living in medieval Christendom, in Islamdom. We're living in medieval Christendom, and we need the help of 21st century Christendom to help us, not to build up barriers and to kick us out. Andalusia used to be a place where there was conversation. You will never have these kind of conversations in the Muslim world today. Those days are gone. We need the West to be that place where Christians, Jews, and Muslims can sit around their horrible texts together and say, look, this is how I dealt with the trauma of my horrible, horrible Deuteronomy text. Learn from it and learn and move forward. That's what I'm talking about on this occasion.
Okay, thank you. Lots of hands up. We've still got plenty of time. So, Alan or Anne-Marie, there's a flickering flame. Can it be fanned higher? Can there be progress towards a compatible form of Islam? Can this be done?
No, I believe that Islam, it is exceptional, it is different. And if I can just go back, because I think I was slightly misunderstood. You yourself asked me, would Old Testament Judaism, was that incompatible? And I said, yes, if Judaism was a missionary religion. There are actually only 2 significant missionary religions that wish to persuade people of their own viewpoint: Islam and Christianity. Hinduism, as mentioned, is not one. Judaism is not one. In other words, they want to, and Sikhism is not one. They want to live their own lives, do their own thing, and it's very, very difficult to convert into them. Christianity and Islam are the 2 great missionary religions. But Christianity, for 300 years until Constantine, never ever used the sword. Jesus never used the sword, never imposed itself. It went around by preaching and teaching and caring for the poor and showing compassion, and that is how it expanded. And the thing that makes Islam unique is it is both missionary and it is willing to use intimidation and violence in order to achieve its ends. Now, one last comment I'd like to make, and then I'll be quiet. I said the way to get away from this bidding war of what the Christians have done over 2,000 years, or the Muslims have done over, or the West have done over the rest of it, and so on, the way to get away is to go back to the origins. The question I have is, Muslims today say that Muhammad is the perfect model for all mankind, for all humankind. That is the official position of normal Muslim. He is the perfect man, and therefore you should behave the way Muhammad did. Muhammad, in his 50s, took a bride aged 6 and had marital relations with her when she was aged 9. Is that what we are supposed to accept in the Western world? Christians do not look at it. Jesus never married himself, but he didn't impose that upon the rest of us and say, if you want to follow me, you mustn't get married. No, it was a spiritual religion. But that is the sort of issue, the sort of value system that go right back to the Quran, as Anne-Marie has said, goes right back to Muhammad, and are relevant for us in 2017. The fact that Muhammad had a wife aged 6 and had marital relationships with her now, what does that mean within Islamic culture? What does that mean for us in the West? We know what it means elsewhere. So the Muslims have to answer that question. It is exceptionalism. It is therefore it is incompatible with Western world.
Thank you. Thank you. And so, putting the Christian perspective to one side for a second, you would acknowledge the change in Judaism. As you said, Muhammad was arguing that there is room for an already nascent change of that kind in Islam. Anne-Marie, what do you think about this? From your perspective, which is very different from Alan's, I know.
Okay. I'm going to have to be the one to bring it back into 2017 again, because in all honesty, someone has to. Look, we've heard that we need to learn from the horrible parts in our own scripture and move on from it. The fact of the matter is that in the West, we have done that. We have learned from our own scriptures and moved on from it. But Islam hasn't, and much of the Muslim world hasn't. Now, this is the difference between us. This is the difference between us. And again, I keep hearing, no matter how many times Alan has demonstrated it, or myself, or people in the audience, that there's no difference between Islam and Christianity. There is a difference between Islam and Christianity, yet we keep hearing there's not. There are fundamental differences that have an impact, a real impact in the world today. One of those, as Alan has mentioned, is child marriage. It is accepted in the hadith that Muhammad married a 6-year-old and raped her when she was 9. Now, this is directly responsible for the rape and forced marriage of young girls in the world today. This is the issue. This is what we need to be talking about. And I'm not sure why a discussion on political correctness and wedding cakes or science labs answers the question whether Islam is compatible with the West or not. It shows a sort of instinct to, when asked to compare the two, the instinct is to attack the West. And I agree with the point on political correctness. We are losing our freedom of speech, and we're losing it for two reasons: political correctness and Islam, which of course are completely linked and completely intertwined. However, having said all that, I mentioned when I spoke the 13 countries in the world that execute people for blasphemy and apostasy, all Islamic, and the Western countries that execute people for blasphemy and apostasy is 0. These are profound differences. They are differences that exist today when it matters. And with all the theology going on, I'll keep being the one to remind people that we have irreconcilable differences between the Islam of 2017 and the West of 2017.
Thank you. Thank you. As a gentleman who's been exploding with interest here in the second row, and we'll take another couple of points from the floor.
I just want to say to Dr. Muhammad about my experience about Islam. I have studied Islam for 12 years in my life. Sharia law, Quran, Hadith, Madhahib, everything. I'm from Baghdad. And I'm Hassani. يعني احنا ولد عم بالاخير. Okay. I don't think Islam or Sharia law under the current terms it works with the modern society, especially here or with the West. So my question for you is: do you think Sharia law can be reviewed and reformed, and as well for Islamic as the Quran and everything, like Hadith and Sharia and other stuff?
Sure. Well, this is actually an area on which colleagues on this table and I have been in conversation about, and Anne-Marie has done work in this area, and we've been in parliamentary discussions about exactly this. The question is, just if I'm correctly, can we
reform it?
Can the classical application, understanding, and implementation of Sharia be reformed?
Yes.
Be reformed. First of all, the question pertains to situations where Sharia has not been applied, and the areas in which they have not been applied have been situations in history where Muslims have had to live under a non-Muslim prince. So it actually arose in the context of these various Sharia councils being established here in the UK, and my argument is very clearly that it's invalid to have Sharia courts or Sharia councils insofar as this is not a country that has a Muslim state, a Muslim principality. And just as you wouldn't build courts in France that applied English law, you should not be building Islamic courts in a jurisdiction, in a political jurisdiction that is non-Muslim. That was the case. So there have been situations. My interest has been primarily with minorities. When it comes to Muslims living in the West, which I think is quite closely linked to the subject of the debate, can Muslims live in a Western context? For example, that's one facet of it. I would argue absolutely there is room for that to happen very rapidly, because there have been situations, for example, when the Ottoman Empire ceded territory to the Russian Tsar, Muslims were obliged to live under a Christian prince, and in those circumstances, religious practice was limited in much the same way as Judaism in exile. That's why it's so important. Judaism and Islam are the two closest related religions in the world. In those situations, in exactly the same way as Judaic law, Judaic punishments were wiped out by Jews living in exile, Muslims living under a non-Muslim prince were obliged to limit those old practices to a form of religion that is purely spiritual and purely pietistic. So it doesn't fully answer the question in the whole Islamic world over whether that's going to happen sooner or later. I think it's going to be a very, very long journey. But certainly in relation to situations where Muslims are obliged to live under secular law, such as, for example, various communist Arab countries where Islamic practices have been suppressed, or when Muslims have lived as minorities under non-Muslim jurisdictions. Under those circumstances, there is the principle of daruriyah, of necessity. If I could finish my point. So where there is a necessity, where you're living under a situation where you cannot practice certain things, then your religion must adapt and change and evolve. And I believe that in history, recent modern history, where Arab states have gone down the line of being communist, or Muslims have lived as minorities, we have seen cases through modern history of situations where Sharia has more or less been wiped out, and Muslims have been obliged to practice a pietistic form of religion, without these other practices. As to your bigger question over whether the whole Islamic world is going to abandon those classical teachings, I think we're talking generations and generations and generations before that happens.
Okay, thank you. So if we could move on, lots of people want to speak at this point. We've got about 45 minutes left. Yes, to the lady just in front there, please.
Yes, hello. I think that Dr. al-Hussaini, clearly has his heart in the right place and is doing the right thing. But you're saying that it's a very long journey to reform Islam, and that there is, of course, a civil war within Islam. But I'm saying, why does it have to be fought in our turf? Absolutely. Destroying our civilization while you fight. And that is my problem. You see, I really have a problem. I completely understand your point, and good luck to you, and I would support that, but not at the expense of my world, and that's my big problem. Yeah.
Just to answer that point, you've made a very important point, and it's a point that I wholeheartedly agree with. What you're seeing on your TV screens when you're seeing sort of the bombing of churches and anti-Semitic outrages and so on, is partly an internal civil war within Islam. Partly sort of Shiism versus Sunnism, partly sort of Daesh versus traditional forms of Islam, partly sort of petrodollar-funded Islam destroying the kind of the ecology of local African Islam in Mali, and superstitious practices in Southeast Asia. That kind of diverse, messy kind of Islam. What you're seeing is exactly that. And what I would say is you're absolutely right. That we are all ending up being collateral damage of an internal dogmatic war that has taken place on a global scale. The situation is, however, that whereas in the Reformation there was a lot of burnings and bloodlettings, now we're talking about 1.6, 1.8 billion people. We're talking about forms of, instruments of violence and war that extend across the world. We're talking about the internet. The whole nature of this problem has become much bigger than, for example, the Reformation bloodletting in Christendom. And that's why, I've always kind of argued, why if you're a fundamentalist Daesh Muslim that prohibits, for example, kind of pictures and paintings, why do you still allow, technological methods to be used in jihad? Why don't you use horses and, and primitive methods? It is a tragedy, and it's an outrage, and it's an appalling thing that ordinary people are becoming the collateral victims of violence by Islamists, but most of those victims are actually sort of people who would self-confess as Muslims as well. So it's a terribly messy situation, and it's a long, bloody journey. But yeah, I fully, wholeheartedly echo your concerns, and that's part of my work.
Okay, let's just take another couple of points from the floor if we can. The gentleman with his hands up right at the back. At the back? Just right in the very back row, on the other side of the hall, thank you. And we'll take one more, and then I'd like to put this back to Alan and Anne-Marie as well for their response to some of the things that have been said.
Thank you. I mean, we've heard many and multitudinous ills committed by Islam and Christianity and monotheistic religions of all sorts. I think I speak, at least for those generationally inferior among us, that, well, personally at least, I see a far bigger question in whether monotheistic traditions, perhaps even theistic traditions, have irreconcilable differences with the West. We are not a majority religious country anymore. And particularly to Dr. al-Hussaini, who I think has been a voice of reason for those of us who are sort of liberally minded and broadly hopeful for the future of this country and the world. I'd be particularly interested to hear your views on that.
Thank you very much. Before we come to that, yes, the gentleman right at the front here. If you could wait for the microphone, so we can all hear, so we can all hear what you're going to say.
Yeah, I've got a question for Dr. Mohammed and also Anne-Marie as well. What are your views on the growing British Islamist groups such as CAGE, MPAC UK, and also MEND, who constantly spout anti-West hate and who basically seem to want Sharia blasphemy law, all criticism of Islam or scrutiny made a criminal offense? What's your opinion on that?
Thank you very much, and that fits very nicely with 2 points that have come up that I'd like to put to the proposition, who've been quiet for a minute or two. The first point was on British Islam, which is effectively what Mohammed started talking about, and what the recent question suggests. Maybe there is no difference between Islam in this country, Islam elsewhere. Is there a way of getting a reconcilable British Islam?
Anything is possible, but again, I'm going to have to bring it back to reality. In theory, probably, if you abandon many of the verses of the Quran and disown many of the hadiths. But let's look at how it works in the real world. There are reformers, people like Ayan Hirsi Ali, for example, and others, Nani Darwish, and we see their lives. They live their lives with death threats. Their lives are in danger. They are consistently demonized by other Muslims or by Muslims, and of course by the left. So where do you begin if you're going to reform Islam or reform Sharia to make it more compatible? Where do you begin when you are not able to criticize Muhammad? How can you possibly reform Islam if you can't criticize Muhammad? How can you possibly reform Islam if you can't criticize the Quran? Because it puts your life in danger. This is the reality. So there are those, as I say, who are trying to reform, but they are despised widely. And I would agree with the lady in the front here. Indeed, it's the most important argument I think that's been made tonight. Even if Islam and Sharia are to reform, it should not do so in the West, because we have already had religious wars, we have already lived through a dark age, and I don't want us to live through another one. We have no obligation whatsoever to host this reform of Islam, and you're right, it will take generations and generations. I want to finally take issue with the notion that most of the victims are Muslims. Well, the Quran condemns non-Muslims page after page after page. It is required, our subjugation is required in the core scriptures of Islam. And in the last couple of years, the slaughter of people all over Europe by jihadi terrorists means that Muslims are certainly not the only victims, although they are often the only ones spoken about. Anish, I think you can guess what I think of those groups. But the most alarming and worrying thing about those groups, they're just talking Islam. As you say, and what I said in my speech is that Islam is Islam. What's different is Muslims, not Islam. And it's the same Islam here as it is elsewhere in the world. The only difference is the practice and what people are allowed to practice, what the law of the land allows them to practice. Muslims vary, Islam does not. But what's most alarming about those groups that you mention, Anish, is how they are promoted, sanitized, not just by the loony left, but by the British state, by having anything to do with numerous groups, the Muslim Council of Britain and all the other ones you've described. MEND has again been defended by members of Parliament recently, if I remember correctly. These people are promoting Sharia law. They are promoting the complete destruction of our freedom, our society, to be replaced by a brutal religious tyranny. And they're being supported in it. And the most important thing we can do in response to that, the most important way to defend ourselves in response to that, is to stop apologizing, stop whataboutery, stop distracting ourselves, and start looking at what that text actually says. That's the starting point. Only then can we hope to reform it. But even if it does reform, I don't want it reforming here.
I'll just like to, I'll go to Michael in a second, and first of all to Alan, but please, on the point that the gentleman at the back raised about liberal, post-Christian, post-religious pluralism, again, it's a bit of a narrower focus than the motion of Islam versus the West, but within a liberal, modern, pluralist society, is there going to be a place? Is there a reconcilable place for Islam in that kind of Britain?
The answer to that is no. I mean, quite clearly no. Islam is something completely other from what we are used to in our society. The point I want to make is this. I've heard this from lots of friends, and at a level, Muhammad is alluding to it. They say, look, Christianity has had its Reformation. We need to wait until Islam has its Reformation. The worrying thing actually is that Islam is having its Reformation quite right now. It is going through that Reformation in certain ways. You see, what happened at the Reformation? There were lots of things wrong with it, but basically what happened was, led by Martin Luther and others, it came out from under the control of this all-controlling Catholic Church based in Rome, came out from that, and how did it come out? It was able to go back to its original scriptures. Because of the printing press, the ordinary man, the ploughman as they would say, could read the New Testament for himself and find out actually what Jesus was on about. Now, it's arguable that actually that's precisely that process is going on at the moment. It's because people like ISIS and other fundamentalists like that are going back to the fundamentals, going back to the text, which Anne-Marie has been talking about, and are taking it seriously and literally, that is the Reformation. And that is the worrying thing. If you go back to Muhammad and go back to the Quran, what you get is ISIS. If you go back to Jesus and you go back to the New Testament, what you get is the Reformation which we had here. Imperfect though it was, very imperfect though it was.
Okay. So, Michael, we have some pretty unequivocal views there. There is no room in a pluralist society for Islam. There is little hope for a British form of Islam. What do you make of all this?
Well, the member of the audience in the front was saying cherry picking is irrelevant. It's not irrelevant because Islam is so many different things. 1.8 billion people. Abu Dhabi, Dubai, UAE, Malaysia, Indonesia, some of the great economic giants of today or tomorrow, these countries are not intolerant. They're Muslim countries. But the book, there's far too much emphasis on this book business. That's not, no, let me finish. 1,000 years ago, Islam was much more tolerant than Christianity. In Spain, Moorish Spain was far more tolerant. Don't tell me about Quran. 1,000 years ago, up to 1492, when the Christians took over Spain back again, Reconquista, they threw out the Muslims. They had to convert to Christianity or go, and the Jews the same. The Sultan of Turkey invited the Jews who'd been kicked out of Spain to come to Turkey, to the Ottoman Empire. That's what we're talking about, tolerance. The difference between Christianity, quiet. Shut up. The difference between Christianity and Islam was exactly that. Islam was more tolerant. Now the question is, why has Islam been taken over to some extent by the more extreme elements? It's, in a way, it's the tail wagging the dog. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Daesh. I think partly it's because of Western interference in their countries. In Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan. Why do we have these extreme forms of Islam? It's partly because of Western influence. But Islam has got the potential for being moderate. It has been. I belong to a club called the Omar. Just a second. Yep. I belong to a club called the Omar Khayyam Club, which celebrates a great genius, a mathematician, an astronomer, a poet, who
also long dead. The point was, what is the future for pluralism and the future? That's why people are getting a bit unsettled.
That's the point I'm making. That
okay,
Islam has
thank you, Michael. Let's have another.
Islam has changed, and it can change again.
Sorry. Let's have another point from the floor, please. Okay, the gentleman here has his hand up. We'll have two gentlemen, both wearing glasses. First of all, the one nearer the front, please.
I just wanted to make 2 points from two of our contributors. Mohammed, you were talking about earlier about how one of the problems that, due to the fact that Western countries sometimes treat the poor and stuff like that, class privilege or whatnot, the fact that how can we complain about Islam being irreconcilable because of how the poorer classes aren't treated as well. You brought Grenfell, for example. Isn't one of the main issues as to why Islam isn't reconcilable with the West is the way of how badly Islamic countries treat their own citizens? And we were talking about Saudi Arabia earlier, the country which has jailed bloggers and lashed them, a country which still, as people pointed out, still kills homosexuals and stuff like that. And also, you're talking about like class privilege in Islamic countries like you take Sudan under Omar al-Bashir or Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, both became billionaires at the expense of their own citizens who became extremely poor, which, doesn't suggest to me that they cared very much about their poor. And I also wanted to, the question I wanted to ask is that and isn't that surely sort of like a false equivalence on that regard? And my other point was I wanted to quickly address what Michael was saying. You were talking about how political correctness and stuff like that involving Islam. As Emery pointed out earlier, don't political correctness and Islam go hand in hand, especially when in this book we have verses which talk about killing people who, or punishing people of whom annoy the Prophet, stuff like that. And political correctness has labelled anyone who is, talks about Islam as fascist and whatnot, especially like we.
Okay, thank you. I think we probably have dealt with that side of things already.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point on that.
Absolutely, thank you. If we could, there was only a few minutes left now, though. If we could go to the gentleman with his hand up just behind you,
okay, sure.
There, next to the aisle, and then maybe hear from somebody who possibly disagrees and who thinks that there is a possible reconciliation.
I don't think
yes,
there is any
please.
reconciliation at all. No, I think one of the great confusions we have, we keep referring to Islam as one of the Abrahamic religions, when if you study it, you'll see that Islam is really a form of paganism which has accumulated, or at least it's plagiarized, texts from Christianity and Judaism. And when I say it's paganism, what I mean is essentially it's about idol worship and it's about blood sacrifice. The idol worship being these 5 prayers made towards this pagan idol rooted in the Kaaba. That's a pagan idol. It always has been. And the blood sacrifice comes from the 111th verse of Surah 9, where it talks about the fact that you have to sacrifice your blood of the jihadists to go out before you can actually get into heaven. There's no entry to heaven, no certain entry to heaven unless you actually die on the battlefield.
Okay. Thank you. Is there anybody who thinks that we will, in Britain at least, in a pluralist society, reach an accommodation between Islam and our values as they are? Yes. Gentleman at the back first to put his hand up.
Debates like this are obviously useful for informing public policy. No doubt the panel is aware of the Chatham House survey earlier this year, which indicated that vast majorities in every single European country would vote to stop Muslim immigration. Couldn't such policy actually be good for both sides? On the one hand, it would start to protect the West against Islam and against Muslim cultures. On the other hand, from a Muslim point of view, surely the only way there will genuinely be a reformation is, firstly, it will come from Europe. It's not going to come from outside Europe. And it will only come as well if Muslims in Europe are actually isolated from the influences of Muslims outside Europe. Thank you. I'm really pleased Mohammed is nodding there, because he's obviously the most important person in the room at the moment. He has a lot to offer. Surely, ironically, banning Muslim immigration is the only way to make Islam genuinely reform. And it will only reform in the West. And obviously, Mohammed is the person who really needs to speak about this.
I'd be fascinated to hear your answer to that specific point on migration.
Migration. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your kind comments. I think, first of all, it's not a personal job of any person. Unfortunately, there's this whole thing of people looking for the Muslim Messiah who's going to save everybody, and it's just not going to happen. Certainly not anybody like me. But what you make a very important point is that we need to re-establish indigenous forms of religion. Islam did, there is a lot of Islamic history where the religion was honored more in the breach, was respected more in the breach than the observance. The Ottoman Empire, providing some examples, African, Southeast Asian forms of Islam where the religion got mixed up with local culture and indeed other religions, and all that's been wiped out systematically over recent history by petrodollar sort of Wahhabist Islam. You're absolutely right. Even in the Balkan during the Balkan Wars, we see the horror of sort of liberal whiskey drinking Islam being sort of wiped out and being established in the image of Wahhabi Saudi-funded mosques and Saudi-provided imams. The petrodollar-funded spreading of this particular brand is highly problematic, and it needs to be looked at. I think I would add to your concerns about migration. I would say that we, at the moment, live in a perpetual first generation in the Muslim community in Britain. We're constantly marrying first generation, whereas the Jewish community and other communities have ended up second, third, fifth, seventh generation. We constantly have incoming from the Muslim world. So those ideas still, those ways of thinking about Islam as Pakistani Islam or Saudi Islam still obtain. And you're quite right on that area. There are a whole area of other things that, colleagues have quite rightly been looking at, Sharia courts and funding, charity funding, and where the money comes from, because he who pays the piper calls the tune. And unfortunately, I think the panel would agree that my job is made even harder in this current climate where, due to downward pressure, shall we say, on academic funding, increasingly Islamic studies departments are funded from the Middle East. And the staffing is approved in that way. I also would, I hope Alan would support me on this. There is a whole kind of culpability from certain self-confessed Christians. When I stood up in the Interfaith Network annual general meeting to point out that organizations such as the Muslim Council of Britain and the Islamic Society of Britain and the Muslim Association of Britain had extremist link. It wasn't a Muslim that stood up to shut me up. It was a Methodist officer of the Christian Muslim Forum that insisted that not only was I to be shut up, but my words were to be redacted from the minutes of the meeting. So we live in a climate where a Muslim academic isn't allowed to talk critically about his own religion. So that's a really important point, and I salute my colleagues here for fighting for that freedom of speech, all of you. In relation to, at the same time, the freedom of speech to talk about the complexity of what leads to Muslim radicalism, it is both theological and it is also sort of existential and ontological. So you've got the Islamist peace lobby saying it's all because of the Iraq war. It's just not true. And then on the other hand, you've got people saying it's entirely theological. It's actually both. It's actually both. And the whole notion and the whole Islam debate has become so polarized that I hope we don't have to wait 15 years to move to a position where we can actually say it's actually a bit of this and it's a bit of that and it's all of these things together. Because certainly in military context, they recognize that, and the military are way ahead of government in relation to understanding what drives jihadism and recognizing that jihadists are not kind of we're not talking, as Charlie quite rightly pointed one time, we're not talking about perverted or extremist interpretations of Islam with Daesh. It is a legitimate interpretation of Islam, and I would argue that there have been other legitimate interpretations, violent interpretations of other religions that have obtained in the past, and we need to learn from that history and move forward with that history. And in relation to the West, I just think, this is the land of my birth, my land of my growing up, but it's a society that has had a 20th century where your internal squabbles have spilled out onto the international stage, and lots of non-European people have died because of world wars, because of the internal struggles within Europe between ideologies, Western ideologies like fascism, Western ideologies like communism that have led to mass genocide. So let's be clear that the West is not entirely beholden to one religious tradition. It has had a bloody history and a bloody colonialist history as well, and the pain that is suffered indeed by the Irish, whom I have close connections to, as well as other parts of the world, have led to resentment. And when you've got books that support theologically motivated violence, you're creating a cocktail for disaster. So thank you for all of that.
And the point about immigration specifically.
Thank you. So if we could, we're going to have to move to summings up. I'll ask the proposition for some thoughts before we do so they have some time. And the final question, there's a gentleman sitting right at the front here. If we could go to him and then we'll move to the summings up because we're almost out of time. Just right in the front row here. Thanks.
At the front, you?
Yes, you, sir. Yeah.
I think that all religions should face up to the hard fact that they don't rule the roost. We live supposedly in a democracy, and one of pretty remote religious connotations. So a little bit of humility wouldn't go amiss. I'm a great believer in community churches of whatever creed, where they do local charity work. They have Vickers tea parties and have social gatherings and community good works. But as long as it's kept at that level and not on some grandiose scheme of ruling the world, then I think that is where religion belongs. And allow democracies to make the laws, not religious laws. A bit of, as I say, humility. I mean, I've studiously engineered my humble position, and it says in the Bible, the meek shall inherit the earth, so I'm waiting for my cut.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, Anne-Marie or Alan, can Islam be kept at that level? Again, can it be one of a number of faiths?
I mean, the evidence is that it isn't. That's the whole point. I mean, I said right at the beginning, there was a wake-up call. The West and Britain was gently sliding into a completely secular, non-church-going society, and then along came 9/11. Life has changed since then, and that is basically what Islam is a missionary religion, and it's a very assertive missionary religion, and it is not planning to leave you alone. It's on its way. And I have to say, there is the difference. Of course, Christianity, of which I'm a committed member of it, is also a missionary religion, but true Christianity is about persuading hearts and minds. It's offering to you. And therefore, it contributes to democracy. So I will put out my Christian ideas into the marketplace and to see how many people vote for it. And if they like my ideas, they will, and if they don't, so on. That's how we work in the West. I have to say, Islam is not like that. It is particularly assertive, it's particularly aggressive, and ultimately, Orthodox normal Islam must believe in a theocracy. And that is what normal. So therefore, whether you like it or not, and I quite understand you like going to Vickers tea parties and the meek will inherit the earth, but it's coming your way. It's coming your way by immigration, it's coming your way by missionary work, by Muslims and so on. So you're going to have to make up your mind where you stand, one way or the other.
Thank you. Sorry, we don't. So we need to be winding up, and there'll be one summing up from each side to bring things to an orderly conclusion. So I'd like to ask Mohammed, please, if you would take 5 minutes just to put your case for one last time.
I'm not going to take 5 minutes, and in fact, I'll just do just speak personally. Actually, I come from a family that's 800 years. Well, it's been drummed into me. 800 years of our family history. Our crescent, our coat of arms has an Islamic crescent, and then around it there's a intertwining arabesque motif that sort of symbolizes our genetics or our genealogy and so on. So it's part of my family history. It's part of my culture. It's the poetry. It's the music. It's all that kind of stuff. It's the poetry. It's the heritage. I'm a deep believer in the one God. I'm a deep believer in the one God, and the bits of scripture that I read point to ilahuna wa ilahukum wahidun wa nahnu lahu muslimun. That our God and your God are ultimately, we're pointing to the same referent, are one and the same, and to him we submit. The leader of Daesh is a Muslim, but so am I. My mum's a Muslim. My best friend is just there. This whole event came out of my best friend and Giles' good friend, and it's out of that friendship of people committed to. And he's more than my best friend. He's my brother, and the best family I've ever had. And he's an Anglican, bless him. And we're committed to speaking truthfully and honestly. And you know, I want to salute the others on this panel for moving the conversation forward from a few years ago when people used to come on to Panorama and just blandly say Islam is a religion of peace every time a bomb went off, and then the next time a bomb went off, and then Islam is a religion of peace. We've moved it forward because of your courage and your commitment to speaking out about the problems with Islamdom. I believe that ultimately this is about God, and religion is, all religion are human attempts to construct a Tower of Babel to reach God, and they're all imperfect. I've dealt extensively with the Church of England, and I see very little of Christ in the hierarchy of the Church of England. I've dealt with supporting survivors of clergy abuse in the Church of England, and I've dealt with the brutality with which ecclesiastical establishments have rejected God and have rather supported religion over God. I confess openly that my relationship, I think you can see, my relationship with my own tradition is an ambivalent one. I feel deeply disturbed by many things within my own tradition, as indeed my rabbinic friends and colleagues feel about stuff in their Talmudic and Tanakh, in their biblical sources, as indeed my Christian friends feel about stuff in their scripture. I believe that God has put that awful stuff into our texts and called it inerrant scripture, and that includes all of it, not just the nice bits. Not just the Sermon on the Mount, it includes the stoning of the contumacious child. It includes the text, the sword verses in the Quran about cutting off, killing unbelievers. And we have been called to struggle with it. There is a story of Abraham, the story of Abraham found in all three of our traditions, sacrificing his son. In Islamic interpretation, and indeed I defer to Christian colleagues, but also in Christian interpretation, it is seen as an absolute act of obedience. It's the same story, it's exactly the same story, but it is interpreted very differently in the Jewish tradition, because in the Jewish tradition, it says that God has commanded you to disobey him. You know, this was an imagination, and the various rabbinic sources have said that the right thing that Abraham was to do was to disobey God. And by disobeying God's command, he did the right thing. So religion is complex, it is ambivalent. My tradition is full of blood, but it's also full of many great things like algebra and Islamic architecture and Andalusia and many things. It is just like ancient Rome built many great things and committed many atrocities, just like Christendom built many wonderful things and also led to so much bloodshed around the world. Just like Western civilization that created the Holocaust also created medical science and also brings us into an environment here in this room, here in London, where we can talk frankly and freely about these things. And may that continue, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, please, if you'd conclude.
Thank you. With respect, only this side has actually answered the question this evening. Alan has given a theological response, I've given us a real-world response. But we're the only ones, this is the only side who've actually answered the question. We've been told what the similarities are between various religious traditions. This was not the question. The question wasn't what have religions got in common. The question was, what are if there are irreconcilable differences between Islam and the West? We have shown over and over again, myself and Alan, that it is completely irreconcilable, both in theory and in practice and in everyday reality. And once again, no matter how clear I try to make it, the point still does not seem to be getting home. The difference between Islam and Muslims. What you're talking about when you talk about you're a Muslim and so is the leader of ISIS, once again, you're talking about Muslims. I am talking about Islam. The question is about Islam. And I went to great lengths to make the distinction between Islam and Muslims, and yet still the same argument is coming back. On the other hand, we have been told that the problem is, of course, the West. Of course it's the West. We're asked essentially to compare the two, and the only criticism goes for the West, even though we have shown that there are greater freedoms, far greater freedoms in the West than there is in the Muslim world. And it's never, no West bashing is complete without, of course, bringing up colonialism or the Holocaust, or trying to imply that our side is arguing that the West is perfect. We're not. We're arguing that it's not compatible with Islam. And I have to make this point because it happens all the time, that the horrors that occur in the name of Islam are somehow the result of Western interference, geopolitical Western interference in Muslim countries. Now that may be that you may have a case there if you were talking about jihadi terror. They certainly do use Western actions as ammunition to recruit for jihadi terror. And no one here is saying, I'm certainly not, that the West is a saint. But there is absolutely no argument to make that the West is in any way responsible for the fact that Saudi Arabia chops off the heads of its own people for blasphemy and apostasy. That is not, can never be the result of Western interference in anything. It is the result of the religion that informs and creates and sustains the brutal legal system in that country. It is religion, it's coming from the religion, it has nothing to do with Western actions. This, again, is whataboutery and distraction to keep us away from the issue at hand. Will it reform in the West? It's probably the best chance. It's probably the best chance, and yes, Muslim immigration will have to stop for that to happen. But how can it reform in the West when our entire social structure, our political structure, our media panders to the very, very worst of Muslim opinion in this country? We pander at every turn. Meanwhile, we turn our backs on ex-Muslims and reform Muslims and cower down and suck up to jihadi groups or jihadis in ties, a suit and tie jihad that has ridiculous amounts of praise and defense not only by our establishment, by across the left. It won't even reform in the West while this apologism continues, while we continue to preach how Islam is a religion of peace. It comes out of everywhere, every leader, religious and political leader. There will be no reform in the West either until we stop pandering, stop pussyfooting, stop pretending that Islam is anything but Islam, and that the horrors that come from Islam have everything to do with Islam. Until that happens, there'll be no reform in the West or anywhere else. So, in answer to the question, I think we have proven beyond any real doubt that there is no reconciling core Islamic notions and beliefs with what we know today as Western freedoms. They are irreconcilable. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. That brings the evening almost to an end. Let's just take one final vote by way of show of hands, however, if we may. The room is somewhat depleted, so we'll just have to go by sort of percentage weighting of some kind. I think it was about 80% for at the beginning. Not that we're very scientific about it. So if all those who believe that Islam and the West have irreconcilable differences after our discussion, if you could please raise your hands. Thank you very much. And all those who would vote against. I think perhaps a little unsatisfyingly we're about where we started, but nonetheless, thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you all for coming, and I wish you safe home and good night.
She looked, I didn't get around to